Colorado's ancient past hides far more than cliff dwellings and old trails. Scattered across its mountains, plains, and desert edges are silent ruins and excavated cities, forgotten caves, and puzzling structures that don't fit neatly into any timeline. These places feel older than the stories we tell about them. And each one leaves you wondering what Colorado still hasn't revealed. Hovenweep Towers. When you first walk up to the Hovenweep Towers, the place doesn't announce itself with anything grand. There is no big entrance sign with theatrics or a sweeping overlook that tries to sell you on the mystery. Instead, you step onto a quiet stretch of high desert where the land looks almost unchanged from 1,000 years ago. The silence feels old here. It settles around you in a way that makes you slow down whether you plan to or not. And then as the trail bends, these stone towers rise out of the landscape like they've been waiting for you to notice them. They stand on the edges of canyons along natural cracks in the earth, perched on boulders that seem too unstable to hold anything, let alone multi-story architecture. And right away, you feel that they aren't normal ruins. They're deliberate, purposeful, and the more you look, the more you start wondering what exactly these ancient builders were trying to protect or understand. The towers are the lasting fingerprints of the ancestral pueblos, people who lived across the Four Corners region long before the arrival of Europeans. But even that simple statement opens a door to bigger questions. These structures don't line up with average domestic buildings. They're built in strange locations, tight canyon rims, narrow points between drain places where the wind cuts hard, and the footing isn't friendly. You imagine trying to build a tower on a rock ledge today, and it already sounds stressful. Now picture doing it with stone tools. No modern scaffolding. In a desert climate where one bad season could be the difference between abundance and hunger. The commitment behind these towers suggests they mattered for reasons beyond ordinary life. As you circle them, it asks hard not to keep scanning the landscape, trying to spot the next one hidden in the stone. Hovenweep isn't one single cluster. It's a spread of sites. Square Tower, Twin Towers, Hovenweep Castle, Boulder House, Cajoni, Holly. Each location has its own layout, its own choices in construction, its own view over the canyon systems. Some towers lean inward slightly, like they were built with careful geometry. Others feature thick walls with tiny windows cut at angles that seem too specific to be random. Many archaeologists think those openings were placed for line-of-sight communication or even possible celestial tracking, especially when you pay attention to how the sunlight moves inside the rooms. But none of these theories lock in with certainty, and that uncertainty is part of what makes Hovenweep feel alive. The site still guards its secrets. The deeper you explore, the more the place plays with perspective. One tower sits directly atop a boulder that split from the canyon wall ages ago. It shouldn't be possible for a stone building to stay balanced on something that unstable. But there it is, surviving centuries of storms and seismic shifts. Another tower sits right at the lip of a canyon, as if the builders wanted a clear, uninterrupted view of whoever crossed below. You start asking yourself, was this territory watched, controlled? Was the community worried about outside threats? Or were these vantage points meant for something else entirely? Maybe spiritual purpose, ritual gatherings, or astronomical observation. The land offers all these possibilities and shuts none of them down. And then there's Square Tower, the most striking structure in the group. It rises nearly perfect and vertical, tucked right next to a spring. Springs in the desert aren't just water sources. They're lifelines. Spiritual sites, places where belief and survival intersect. Building a tower next to a spring might mean protection or reverence, or both. You look at the towers, smooth corners, the precision of its masonry, the shadow it casts into the canyon. You can't shake the sense that whoever built it cared about the message it sent to anyone approaching from a distance. But, as impressive as the towers are, the real mystery rests in what's missing. By around the late 1200s, the entire region was almost suddenly abandoned. The ancestral Pueblo communities that had developed elaborate architecture, agriculture, and trade connections across the southwest didn't fade slowly. They relocated, leaving behind towers, homes, storage rooms, pottery, and the remains of daily life. Why? The theories weave together: climate change, so estrus warfare, spiritual shifts, or something more complex involving all of those at once. But walking among the towers, that question feels heavier. You can picture a community climbing these ladders, keeping watch over these canyons, tending crops, gathering water, raising families, and then one generation later, the place falls quiet. some visitors feel a strange emotional pull at wheat. Not fear or unease, just a sense that the land remembers more than it shows. The wind whooshes through the canyon in a steady, hollow tone. Ravens sometimes drift above the towers, circling like they're tracing invisible boundaries. When you place your hand on one of the walls, the stone still holds the warmth of the sun. It's easy to imagine the builders doing the same thing centuries ago, checking the alignment of a new stone, measuring a foundation, or pausing to watch the horizon. These towers aren't ruins the way European castles are ruins. They are closer to preserved thoughts, ideas set in stone, left behind by people whose names we will never know. The layout of the structures hints at patterns that aren't fully understood. Some towers are round, others square or deep. Some contain multiple rooms stacked vertically. The craftsmanship varies from site to site, suggesting different families or groups contributed their own techniques, yet they all fit within a shared tradition of stone architecture found across the region. That consistency raises more questions about how people coordinated building styles over long distances. If the towers communicated with one another or served as waypoints in a broader network, that network has vanished from written memory. But when you stand in the canyon and look from one tower to another, you can't ignore the sense that they're part of a system. Even today, the site isn't heavily developed. You won't find crowds or loud displays. The trails are simple and clean, letting the ruins speak for themselves. When the sun starts dropping, the towers glow orange along the edges and the shadows stretch like they're reaching across the canyon. If you stay long enough into twilight, the sky deepens into a dark blue dome, and the stars come out sharp and clear. It hits you then that ancient people likely watched the same stars from these towers. Maybe they used them to track seasons, or maybe they just found comfort in knowing the sky was predictable, even when the world on the ground was. In the present day, Yuan is protected, but it still feels fragile. The structures aren't restored with heavy-handed reconstruction. They're stabilized, cleaned, and left as close to original condition as possible. That means some walls remain cracked, and some towers lean a little, but that honesty adds to the atmosphere. You're not walking through a replica. You're walking through what remains of a once living community. If you ever visit, one of the strongest impressions is how quiet it is, even with other people around. The land absorbs sound. You can hear the crunch of your own steps, the soft roll of wind, the occasional bird. It has the kind of quiet that makes you think more slowly and notice details you'd usually skip over. The texture of a stone, the pattern of a doorway, the faint reddish tones in the mortar. When you leave, you carry that stillness with you for a while. Hovenweep's mystery isn't dramatic or loud. It sits in the architecture, the sudden abandonment, the unanswered questions, and the way the towers continue to stand despite everything time has thrown at them. The site feels like a conversation that never got finished. It offers clues, but not conclusions, and maybe that's why it lingers in your head long after you walk away. Lowry Pueblo. When you first arrive at Lowry Pueblo, it doesn't try to impress you with dramatic cliffs or towering monuments. Instead, it sits quietly on a flat stretch of desert, almost blending into the landscape if you're not paying attention. At a glance, the place looks simple: a cluster of stone walls, a wide open sky, a hush that feels too deep for a site this close to the modern world. But the more time you spend here, the more you realize how unusual Lowry Pueblo truly is, and why it stands out among the ancient sites of the Mesa Verde region. The first thing you notice is its layout. Lowry isn't scattered across mesas or hidden inside canyons like many other ancestral Pueblo settlements. It's compact and deliberate, almost like the builders wanted everything organized around a central idea. That idea hits you the moment you walk up to the Great Ka. It sits at the heart of the ruins, wide and circular, built with a level of precision and intention that tells you it wasn't a casual construction. Great Kas aren't simple gathering places. They are ceremonial, communal, and deeply symbolic. When you stand on the edge of this one, looking down into the space where ancient people once met, planned, prayed, and performed rituals, you start to understand why Lowry Pueblo feels different from the moment you approach. Archaeologists believe this site was a hub, a place that connected several surrounding communities. It wasn't the biggest settlement in the region, but it carried weight. The Great Ka alone suggests that gatherings here weren't limited to a handful of families. This was a place meant to bring people together. The thought of hundreds of footsteps converging on this open desert space, carrying offerings, stories, traditions, adds a quiet sense of reverence to the air. It makes the site feel larger than its footprint, Lowry Pueblo was built around the early 1100s, during a period when the ancestral PBLON world was evolving fast. Populations were growing, architectural skill was advancing, and communities were becoming more interconnected. You can see that progression in the stonework here. Many of the walls are constructed with a beautiful Koran veneer technique where well-shaped stones form the outer faces and rubble fills the inner space. The craftsmanship is consistent and confident. You can tell the builders knew exactly what they were doing. Walking along the walls, you can almost imagine the place alive. Rooms stacked beside each other, doorways carefully placed, storage chambers tucked into corners. The PBLO once rose multiple stories, and people lived here season after season, generation after generation. You might hear the wind rushing across the open ground. But if you close your eyes, you can picture voices bouncing off these walls. The sounds of daily life, mixing with ritual gatherings in the Great Car. But the real mystery appears when you look at Lowry Pueblo in context. It's set far from water sources in a zone that doesn't seem ideal for long-term habitation. Today, the landscape feels dry and exposed with sagebrush and rabbit brush stretching into the distance. It makes you wonder why such an important ceremonial structure was built here and not closer to the larger agricultural centers of the time. Some researchers think this site was chosen for reasons we can't fully map today. Perhaps a boundary marker, a spiritual way, or a meeting area for multiple clans. Others think the environment wasn't as harsh centuries ago, that climate and resources shifted dramatically, leaving the site more isolated than it once was. As you step between the rooms, it becomes clear that whatever drew people here was powerful enough to justify the effort. One of the most intriguing parts of Lowry Pueblo is the evidence that some of the architecture predates the main occupation period. It is possible that this location held significance even before the large-scale construction began. A place with a history that stretches deeper than the PBLO itself. Maybe the builders recognized an older story tied to this ground and chose to honor it by creating something larger and more elaborate. Standing there, you can almost sense layers of time stacked beneath your feet. Of course, like so many Pueblo sites, Lowry raises the familiar question: why was it eventually abandoned? By the late 1200s, the entire region saw a major migration as the ancestral Pueblo peoples moved south. Climate instability, drought, social stresses, and resource pressures are all possibilities. But at Lowry, the abandonment feels especially abrupt. When archaeologists excavated the site, they found tools left behind, as if people intended to return. Some rooms still held storage vessels. The Great Car, once a centerpiece of community life, fell silent without any clear signs of conflict or destruction. There's a certain heaviness to that silence. You stand inside the Great Car, its floor now open to the sky because the protective roof is long gone. And imagine what the last ceremonies must have felt like. Maybe the final gathering wasn't a dramatic farewell, but something quieter. Maybe the people hoped the rain would return and the community would resume life as normal. Maybe the last fire lit in the car was meant to be one of many, and then time moved on, and they didn't come back. Today, the site is preserved with a light touch. Modern stabilization keeps the wall standing, but nothing here feels overly reconstructed. You can still see the original stones shaped by hand centuries ago. You can still trace the outlines of rooms without feeling like you're walking through a museum exhibit. That authenticity makes the site feel raw in the best way. It hasn't been polished into a tourist spectacle. It's simply there, open to the sky, letting visitors interpret its story for themselves. The quiet at Lowry Pueblo can catch you off guard. There's so much open land around it that sound travels smoothly, but softly. You might hear a hawk circling high above, or the crunch of a lizard in the brush. But mostly it's just you, the stones, and the wide horizon. The air smells faintly of dust and sun-warmed sage. You notice how the wind breaks differently against the walls. Slower, almost respectful. It's the kind of place that encourages reflection without forcing anything on you. As you walk back toward the Great Car one more time, you might start to picture how this place looked on a night filled with firelight. The PBLO would have glowed softly, the car buzzing with activity, shadows moving along the earth and walls as people gathered to talk, plan, or pray. You can almost hear distant voices drifting across the land. The feeling lingers even after you leave the site. Lowry Pueblo was more than a settlement. It was a meeting ground, a ceremonial heart, and a place chosen with meaning that isn't fully visible anymore. In the present day, Lowry still carries that quiet gravity. There's nothing flashy here. No dramatic cliffs or complicated ruins. Yet, the mystery is strong, rooted in why people chose this place, why they invested so much into building it, and why they eventually walked away. The answers shift depending on how long you stay and how much you pay attention. It's a site that doesn't insist on a single interpretation. Instead, it leaves space for you to stand in the wind, look across the desert, and consider how much of the ancient world still sits just under the surface, waiting for someone to notice. Franktown Cave. Franktown Cave sits on the edge of Colorado's high plains, tucked into a sandstone ridge that looks ordinary until you step closer and realize you're staring at an entrance that has sheltered human life for thousands of years. This place doesn't announce itself the way cliff dwellings do. There are no towering walls or dramatic overlooks. Instead, Franktown Cave feels quiet, almost withdrawn, as if it's holding on to secrets. It has no intention of giving up as that part of what makes it such a strange and compelling sight. The deeper you get into its story, the more you realize how unusual its archaeological record is, and how much it refuses to fit neatly into the wider picture of Colorado's ancient past. What makes Franktown Cave stand out is its timeline. Evidence shows people were using this shelter for more than 5,000 years, spanning several cultural periods that usually don't appear in the same spot. The early occupants lived here long before pottery, long before the settled villages in the southwest rose and fell. Later groups came through during the Archaic period and still later during the era when pottery baskets and established trade networks started connecting distant cultures. Most sites in Colorado give you a snapshot of a single cultural moment. Franktown Cave gives you a stack of them layered like pages in a long diary. And those layers tell a story that suggests this cave wasn't just a convenient shelter. It may have been a kind of crossroads, a place where different groups paused, camped, hunted, and left pieces of their world behind. Standing at the entrance today, you can picture why it worked so well. The cave is shallow, but wide enough to shelter a family group. And woven items, baskets, mats, even sandals survived long enough to be studied, offering a rare window into craftsmanship that usually disappears in Colorado's climate. The preservation alone would make the cave interesting, but it's the combination of items that creates the mystery. Why did so many different cultural styles converge in one place? Was the cave simply in a perfect location, or did it serve a purpose we haven't fully understood? Some researchers suggest that Franktown Cave may have been part of a quiet exchange network, a spot where plains cultures and mountain cultures overlapped, trading materials or knowledge without leaving behind the more organized structures found in southwestern Colorado. Others think the cave might have been used seasonally by a single cultural lineage that changed and adapted over time, leaving behind different styles as generations passed. But even those ideas raise questions. Many of the artifacts don't match the typical styles of the surrounding region. Some of the pottery resembles pieces from far south of Colorado. Some of the stone tools seem to echo traditions from the Great Basin. The variety is unusual enough that it's hard not to wonder whether the cave attracted travelers, wanderers, or groups testing new routes across the landscape. When you walk through the site today, it's easy to feel the weight of that long timeline. Most of the excavated areas are closed to protect fragile layers, but you can still stand near the ridge and look out over the rolling plains. The view stretches far, almost unbroken, and you start to understand why people kept coming back. The land itself feels like a natural meeting ground. The air carries a faint dryness and a quiet stillness that's different from the mountains behind it. Even without knowing the archaeology, you'd sense this was a place to pause and regroup. Another lingering mystery involves the cave's shifting function through time. Early layers show a focus on hunting and tool-making. Later ones reveal grinding stones and plant remains, suggesting more varied diets and perhaps longer stays. Still later layers contain textiles, rare, carefully crafted items that usually indicate domestic activity, but there's no evidence of permanent settlement. No large hearths, no refuge piles, new structures, so the cave feels like a temporary home, but not a casual one. People returned often enough to leave behind meaningful pieces of their world, yet never stayed long enough to build anything lasting. Some archaeologists argue this pattern hints at ritual or ceremonial use. It's possible the cave held significance that wasn't only practical. The mix of artifacts, especially those preserved textiles, might reflect activities we don't fully understand. Moments of preparation before traveling deeper into the plains or gatherings between groups who did unshare a permanent home, but met here for specific reasons. The truth is, none of the theories fully fit the evidence. The cave keeps its answers close. Another compelling question centers around the cave's final periods of use after thousands of years of intermittent occupation. The record tapers off. There's no dramatic event indicated in the layers, no sudden destruction, no obvious shift in climate indicators. People simply stopped coming. Whether they moved to more stable settlements, shifted migration patterns, or experienced larger cultural changes remains unclear. The end is as quiet and understated as the cave itself. Visiting the area today, you won't find a tourist-heavy site or interpretive center. Franktown Cave isn't developed the way Mesa Verde or Chimney Rock are. Much of it is protected and kept out of public access to preserve the fragile deposits, but the general landscape around it is accessible, and it still carries the same atmosphere that must have drawn people long ago. The wind moves across the grass in long, low waves. The ridge whizzes gently. Nothing dramatic, but enough to give the sense of shelter. The quiet is one of the first things you notice. There is a kind of stillness that settles over the area in the late afternoon that feels older than the land itself. From a modern perspective, the site's biggest positives are its archaeological richness and its untouched quality. Few places in Colorado preserve this much layered history with so little disturbance. But that same protection means access is limited, which some people find disappointing. You can't simply walk into the cave or explore the excavation areas. Most of what we know comes from controlled digs and preserved collections. If you're someone who likes hands-on exploration, Franktown Cave can feel a little out of reach. Still, even from the outside, the place sparks imagination. It's the enormity of time that lingers with you. The idea that people paused here again and again across thousands of years, each leaving small pieces that when put together form one of Toledo's strangest archaeological puzzles. And after learning its story, the land around the ridge feels different. You look across those rolling plains and think about all the footsteps that passed this way long before roads, fences, or towns existed. My own take is that Franktown Cave is one of those sites where the mystery is in a single question but in the accumulation of little ones. Why did so many different groups come here? What made this cave so important? And why did the visits stop? None of the answers feel complete. And maybe that's what keeps the place interesting. It doesn't try to impress. It doesn't offer spectacle. It just holds its history quietly, leaving you with a feeling that something important happened here. Something we're only just beginning to understand. Yucca House, an excavated city. Yucca House is one of those places that doesn't look like much when you first arrive. There are no tall walls rising from the ground, no reconstructed buildings, no polished visitor center. At a glance, it's just a quiet patch of land surrounded by open fields and low mounds. But once you start digging into its story, because the site itself has never been excavated, you realize you're really standing on what might be one of the largest and least understood ancestral plume cities in Colorado. That's where the mystery begins. Yucca House is hiding something enormous beneath the soil, and for more than a century, archaeologists have hesitated to disturb it. The site sits at the base of Sleeping Ute Mountain near Cortez. When you're there, the view feels wide and old, like the land has been waiting a long time for someone to listen. The surface gives nothing away, just gently rising mounds, stretching across almost 100 acres. But ground surveys and surface pottery scatter tell a different story. They suggest this wasn't just a village, it was a major center, a regional hub, occupied for centuries, during the height of the Pueblo world. Some estimates say it may have held massive great houses, ceremonial plazas, multi-story structures, and an entire community network woven into the landscape. That's why people call it the unexcavated city. It's not just a catchy name. Yucca House truly is a city-sized archaeological site that we still know almost nothing about. And it's one of the rare places in the Southwest where time has only been disturbed by reconstruction projects or archaeological trenches slicing through the soil. Everything is still where it was left centuries ago, intact, buried, protected by silence. The origins of Yucca House stretch back at least to the 1100s. During this time, the surrounding region was alive with movement and growth. Places like Mesa Verde and Hovenweep were either rising or reaching their peak. Migration patterns were shifting, alliances were forming, and people were building increasingly complex settlements. Yucca House seems to have been part of that moment. Large, coordinated, and strategically placed. Yet, unlike most major Puebloan centers, it was never mapped in detail or excavated to reveal its internal layout. One of the mysteries that keeps researchers guessing is why the site was abandoned. When you look out across those quiet mounds today, there is no obvious sign of conflict or destruction, no evidence that a sudden event forced residents to flee. Instead, the settlement seems to have faded along with many others in the region around the late 1200s, part of a larger migration away from the Four Corners. What pushed this movement is still debated. Climate stress is one theory. Drought cycles made agriculture unpredictable. Another suggests socio-political tensions, a breakdown in the networks that connected distant communities. But none of these fully explained why a site as large as Yucca House was simply left behind. What deepens the intrigue is how little we've actually confirmed because the site hasn't been excavated. Every conclusion remains a theory. The pottery scattered on the surface hints at long-term occupation. The size of the mound suggests multi-story structures, but the specifics, how many people lived here, how they organized their community, what ceremonies took place, those details are locked beneath the soil. There's a quiet sense of restraint around Yucca House. Archaeologists have chosen not to dig because excavation is irreversible. Once you uncover a site, you expose it to air, moisture, and time. You also alter its condition forever. Because Yucca House sits on private land, and because the Puebloan descendants consider it deeply significant, the idea of leaving it untouched has gained strong support in an unusual way. The mystery is protected by respect. The decision to keep the site whole has turned the entire landscape into a time capsule. Walking the property today gives you a strange feeling of absence and presence at the same time. You don't see walls or painted plaster or carved beams, but you feel the echo of something large under your feet. When the late afternoon sun hits the mountains, you can see gentle outlines, ridges forming the edges of great houses, raised lines that might mark plazas or communal areas. It's like looking at a sleeping city. Everything important is still there, just resting below a thin layer of soil. The setting itself adds to the atmosphere. The open land around Yucca House feels almost untouched. You can hear the wind brushing across the grass, carrying dust from fields and distant mesas. Sleeping Ute Mountain watches over it in the distance, giving the whole area a sense of quiet guardianship. There are no crowds, no noise, no pressure to move quickly. You can take your time wandering the edges of the mounds, imagining the footsteps that once moved across this same ground centuries ago. One of the most curious questions surrounding Yucca House is its purpose within the ancient world. Some researchers believe it was a major political or ceremonial center coordinating with other nearby settlements. Others suggest it may have been an anchor point for a larger regional community. Its size alone supports that idea, but without excavation, no one can say for sure what happened inside those unexposed rooms. Maybe important rituals took place here. Maybe leaders met here to plan migrations or seasonal strategies. Or maybe it was simply a thriving village that grew larger than expected, shaped by a booming population and fertile land. There's also the question of what still lies beneath the surface. Great storage complexes, multi-room dwellings stretching across terraces, every possibility feels just out of reach. And because the site remains untouched, there is a sense that new technologies like ground-penetrating radar or aerial LiDAR might someday reveal a layout without ever breaking the soil. That potential future keeps the mystery alive. From a visitor's perspective, the experience at Yucca House is refreshing in its simplicity, but not without a few challenges. The lack of development means there are no paths, markers, or detailed displays. You're expected to walk thoughtfully and avoid disturbing the land. Some people find that peaceful. Others prefer clearer structure. Getting there can also be tricky, since access crosses private property. But once you arrive, the quiet is the first thing you notice. It's a different kind of archaeological site, one that asks you to imagine rather than observe. Today, the biggest positive is that Yucca House remains one of the most intact ancestral Puebloan sites in the entire Southwest. Its untouched nature makes it invaluable for future research and for the living PBLO communities who see the land as part of their heritage. The downside is simply that we don't get the visual clarity other sites offer. There's no reconstructed cliff dwelling to admire, no excavated rooms you can peer into. Everything requires imagination, but maybe that's what gives Yucca House its power. You're looking at a place that holds an entire city beneath your feet, waiting quietly, unaltered by modern hands. The fact that we haven't uncovered it makes it one of Colossus's last great archaeological mysteries. And standing there with the land stretching out around you, and the mountain casting its shadow from the west, you can't help but feel the pull of that mystery. It leaves you with the sense that some stories are meant to rest a little longer, held safely in the earth until the right moment arrives to reveal.